Part three of our presentation is just a very brief look at some of the situations that have brought us to the point that we are at today and that are driving the cause for concern that we are experiencing among the public. The Official Languages Act was adopted in 1969, and it contained progressive implementation which didn't come fully into effect until 1977. However, over time, so many changes were proposed, primarily by Francophone associations, although not solely by them, that it was deemed necessary to completely rewrite the laws and policies. The Act was repealed and replaced by the new Official Languages Act on June 7, 2002. This new act was much broader in scope and had many amendments, including the active offer of service and obligations on cities and on municipalities with a minority language population of 20%. In June of 2013, Bill 72 amended it again in response to recommendations from a select committee, which included Francophone organizations but did not have Anglophone representation. These meetings were held behind closed door and were deemed too emotional or too controversial for the public. The results imposed obligations on professional associations enabled by an active legislature, and also affects the private sector, which is supposedly exempt from the Official Languages Act, by including associations such as real estate agents, hairdressers, barbers, lawyers, physicians, etc. It's also important to note that government meets yearly as well as on an as-needed basis with Francophone interests. However, no Anglophone interests receive the same courtesy. The next revision of the Official Languages Act is due no later than December 31st, 2021, which is only 5 years away, unless it's revised early. However, it's important to note that the provincial election is only 3 years away. Another document which has contributed to the situation in which we currently find ourselves is the Language of Work Act. It was introduced in 1988, and over the years it has also evolved, but it is intended to broaden the scope and opportunities for employees within departments and agencies of the New Brunswick Public Service to work in their language of choice. It means that personnel and payroll services, yearly performance appraisals, and necessary work instruments be available to employees in their preferred official language. It also means that staff can communicate with head office and line departments can communicate with central agencies in their daily work, meetings, discussions, or when drafting documents. So at first look, both of these sound fair and reasonable. English and French are both of equal status and have equal rights and protections. So what's wrong with this? Well, in theory, nothing. In practice, however, several things. Cities and municipalities with a minority language of 20% or higher are required to ensure that communication of all public information, websites, documents, minutes of meetings, etc., are available in both official languages, regardless of use. Now let's look at the situation in Fredericton, where as far back as 2011, it was called into question whether the costs of translation services at City Council meetings was justified or not. It was stated that $1,200 per meeting is the cost of having these services available, and yet the counselor who brought that to attention could only recall those services being used once in the past 8 years. So at $1,200 a shot, that's a pretty expensive service to have available if it's not going to be used. It also means that communities often have to hire or attract employees from outside of their community in order to meet the mandate, as opposed to hiring locally. For example, if you live in Caraquet, which only has a 2% Anglophone population, or if you live in Hampton, New Brunswick, which only has a 3% Francophone population, they may not be able to hire a local individual to work at Services New Brunswick or to work at the local liquor store who is bilingual. So they're going to have to seek an employee from outside of their area to come in and do the job instead of being able to hire locally, and that's a problem. The Commissioner of Official Languages has suggested that all senior positions should be mandated bilingual, and has actually stated that it is no longer acceptable in the province of New Brunswick that senior positions can be filled by an individual who is unilingual. And that applies to a Francophone unilingual just as much as it does to an Anglophone unilingual. Paramedics, ambulances. In Ontario, they use a 911 service that serves 170 language. That has been deemed unacceptable in New Brunswick by our language commissioner. As a result, paramedics are being recruited from other provinces to come in and meet language quotas, while our own highly skilled paramedics are either going unemployed or are being employed on a casual, insecure basis. The reality is that the demand for bilingual has exceeded the availability. New Brunswick is now holding job fairs in Francophone or Francophile areas with a targeted plan to attract French immigrants, and this is another issue that we'll be discussing a little later on in our presentation. In her 2014-2015 annual report, the Commissioner of Official Languages stated that her office is chronically underfunded at $506,000 a year. However, she reported that 92.3% of her budget is required for the salaries and benefits of her office staff. The remaining 7.7% covered the expenses associated with the small number of 170 complaints received last year, of which only 80 were deemed admissible. 47 were found to be inadmissible, and 43 were referred to other departments. While some of these complaints dealt with genuine concerns such as health care, many were based on the manner in which a telephone was answered, how the word fish was spelled on a French brochure, the inability to select and pay for alcohol in the language of choice, and the inability to speak with a manager at a golf pro shop in the language of choice. So we need to ask ourselves, is this a reasonable or even a justifiable use of our tax dollars? I'd like you to consider these two issues. I'm sure that you've all heard about school buses. The Minister of Education is currently going to court in an effort to protect the separation of children on school buses according to language. This forced separation has led to some rural communities being run by full-sized buses traveling as much as 50 kilometers each way, carrying only 2 to 3 students. Where no language-appropriate driver could be found locally, and this is only one of a few known examples, one was hired to travel from Moncton to Fredericton and be housed in a hotel all week long, returning home on the weekends. This means 2 buses, 2 drivers, 2 sets of insurance, 2 maintenance and repair bills, 2 tanks of fuels, to travel essentially the same route at less than half capacity. Obviously, based on population, there are areas where having 2 buses simply makes sense. However, there are a number of areas where it does not. And another issue that I would like you to consider before we move into the next part of our presentation is daycare. Another matter that is currently being considered is language-specific daycares to be managed under the education system. Not only does this further separate our communities and lead to setting a poor example of integration, tolerance, acceptance, and cooperation, but consider this. There are currently supplements available to assist with the cost of childcare. If daycare falls under the education system, which is already paid for, does this mean that low-income families will lose their child care subsidies? School hours are also very different than daycare hours. So how do parents manage those hours when their children is not in school? And ask yourself, is there really a danger that our children pose to one another by attending the same daycare and mingling with one another? Should this even be an issue?